thanks to everyone else who's joining with me today. I'm glad to be able to present today on my thesis topic, Building the Regional Grain Economy, a Comparative Analysis of Regional Grain Initiatives. I wanted to first thank Chris as my thesis chair and my readers Alice and Elizabeth Dick from Oberon for all their super helpful suggestions and feedback on my research and writing. Their guidance and direction truly helped elevate my understanding of regional grain systems and approach to research. I'm glad that we're holding this presentation remotely for safety reasons, but the only downside is that we can't share any grainy snacks. So I don't consider myself a very good cook, so I was excited over the last few years to experiment with making different things from grains for the first time. Some of these grains came from local farms, some we grew at Chatham, and others came from further afield, like the famous Carolina gold rice from South Carolina and wild rice and kernza from Minnesota. I wish I could share with you all. My motivation for this project stemmed from a few things and really started in the fall of 2014 when I began working for PASA, the Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Agriculture. Just about a month into the job, I was asked to attend a field day and write about it for the PASA newsletter. The day took place at Ernst Conservation Seeds in Meadville and was about seed cleaning, a subject I knew nothing about, but which is important for grain growers selling into regional markets. I found myself surrounded by huge grain bins and augers and lots of machinery that I had never seen before, and hearing names like air screen cleaner, indent separator, and debearder. That was also the first time that I met Elizabeth Dick. Later in my work with PASA, I also met a farmer that was growing grains and facing challenges due to a lack of equipment for proper storage, bagging of the grains, and milling. As a result, some of his harvest was getting spoiled or unable to be sold. Around this time, I also became aware that the locavore diet largely lacked staple crops like grains and beans. And I was further interested in these crops to enable a locally produced vegetarian diet. So given this, the original question that I started with was, what opportunities exist to strengthen the regional grain economy? And why is this important? The first reason is the nutritional importance of staple crops. Globally, over half of calories consumed come from three main crops: wheat, corn, and rice. These cereal grains are part of a broader category of foods called staple foods that constitute a large portion of the daily diet of many peoples. Other staple crops around the world consist of grains like sorghum and millet, roots and tubers, and pulses. In the US, the 2015 Dietary Guidelines for Americans recommends 45 to 65% of calories consumed come from carbohydrates, which includes fruits and vegetables, but also starches such as rice, corn, pasta, and bread. And grains, which previously occupied the base of the U.S. food pyramid, now represent about a quarter of my plate. And I peeked at the 2020 dietary guidelines that were just released in December, and it looks like they make the same recommendations in these categories. Due to their ability to be easily stored and transported, many staple crops became commodities, produced through methods of industrial agriculture and reliant upon an extensive system of infrastructure to transport them through the global commodity food system. While this system has the ability to capitalize on economies of scale and produce a huge amount of food in a largely efficient manner, it is fraught with many challenges. The global commodity food system is a complex system that can be affected by climate factors, international trade, the use of grain crops for biofuels, and agricultural commodities speculation, often resulting in price volatility and tenuous supply chains. This has negatively affected both farmers and consumers at different times. Farmers faced with low prices may attempt to improve their own returns by boosting production, which ironically leads to oversupply and further price decreases. The low rate of return to farmers has driven them to leave their farms for work in cities and has resulted in increased farmer suicide rates. On the other hand, high prices may prohibit consumers from securing sufficient food. For example, during the 2007 World Food Price Crisis, the price of major grains and oilseeds rose 85% and led to hunger around the world. Other issues with the global food system relate to the manner of crop production. Industrial agriculture, through the reliance on intensive tillage, monocultural production, and use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, contributes to soil erosion, water pollution, hazards from the use of chemicals, and deterioration of the natural environment. Monocultural production systems are more susceptible to major disruptions by pest and disease, as well as droughts, floods, and natural disasters. Industrial agriculture has also contributed to the loss of carbon sinks and increase in greenhouse gas emissions, which further contributes to climate change. These challenges point to a need for improvements or alternatives. For one, production systems should be resilient and sustainable and aim to conserve and improve natural resources. Resilient production systems promote genetic diversity, biological diversity, and have a variety of species in production. Sustainable production practices include reducing tillage and the use of chemical inputs, utilizing cover crops and crop rotations, and encouraging habitat for biodiversity. Local and regional food systems may also provide a viable alternative to the global commodity food system by increasing profitability for farmers and businesses along the supply chain and delivering community economic development impacts. A report issued by the USDA's Economic Research Service indicates that consumers are willing to pay more for locally produced food, and farmers operating in local food systems may retain a greater share of the consumer food dollar. By contrast, within the commodity food system, for every $1 a consumer spends on a food purchase, only 15 cents goes to the farmer. The rest is spread out across food processing, packaging, distribution, wholesale, retail, and other industries that support the food getting to the end consumer. Food system scholars Clancy and Ruff suggest that the regional scale may be better suited to achieve sustainability than the local scale, due to a larger land base to supply a greater variety of products and a scale that may increase transportation efficiencies. Yet they also suggest that integration across scales, local, regional, national, and global, is necessary for food system resilience. I also looked at value chains and value chain coordination as another strategy to develop regional food systems. Value chains are known fully as values-based supply chains, food supply chains, or food value chains, and are strategic alliances between farmers or ranchers and other supply chain partners that deal in significant volumes of high-quality, differentiated food products and distribute rewards equitably across the chain. This approach is most often geared towards farms of the middle, which Dunning explains as those farming operations too small to easily enter into conventional retail and food service channels, and too large to survive by selling only direct to consumer. Also, farmers are strategic collaborators in the value chain, as opposed to anonymous input suppliers that can be easily replaced. They often reap a higher percentage of the consumer food dollar, and storytelling about producers forms an integral strategy in communicating the value chain identity and principles. Product differentiation is achieved when businesses along the value chain share mission values, such as farm viability, farmland preservation, healthy food access, and sustainable production practices, and operational values, such as accountability, long-term commitment, open and ongoing communication, and transparency, and communicate these values with their target consumer. In value chains, success is often determined by triple bottom line outcomes. That's economic, social, and environmental, as opposed to just a focus on increased revenue. And value chains require strong relationships among partners in the chain, rooted in trust, transparency, collaborative business planning, shared risk, and reward. The Wallace Center at Winrock International is a food systems-focused nonprofit organization that worked with the USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service to lay out a set of best practices and guides on value chain coordination. They define value chain coordination as a market-based approach to developing local and regional food systems that better serve communities, which is achieved by leveraging soft infrastructure in the form of skills, competencies, and relationships so that value chain participants are better prepared to acquire and utilize hard infrastructure, such as equipment, trucks, and warehouses in their communities. The Wallace Center lays out a series of roles of value chain coordination, which I will come back to later as a point of analysis. But for now, I just want to point out what it says for convening events. If you note, convenings foster an environment for all other roles to take place. Due to their prominence as a value chain coordination strategy, convening events take a central role in this research. Before I dive into the research, I want to mention a few more terms that appear. First, the grain chain is a spin-off of the value chain concept specifically for grains. Secondly, grain shed is a spin-off of the food shed concept, which originally derived from the watershed concept. And this approach looks at a central metropolitan area and the surrounding food-producing region that supports it, in this case specifically for grains. The regional grain economy is a term that has become popularized with the renaissance of regional grain initiatives. It is a direct permutation of the term regional food economy and points to the important economic benefits conferred to regions through the development of regional food systems. But I want to suggest that perhaps a more appropriate term to describe what I'm discussing today is non-commodity grain systems. For one, while market relationships and economic development are key parameters for regional food system development, there are other parameters that might constitute important elements of the regional food system, including social, political, and environmental elements, art, culture, and religion. Secondly, the regional descriptor can be limiting, as some value chain solutions exist that span beyond what might be considered the extent of a region, yet provide valuable insight into possible iterations of beneficial and successful market relationships. Due to its prominence and usage, I continue to use the term regional grain economy and use it interchangeably with non-commodity grain systems. So with this background, I developed a new set of questions divided into two parts. My overarching question was, what are the opportunities and considerations for the development of non-commodity regional grain systems? For the first part of the analysis, I had a series of sub-questions. What type of entities and initiatives are involved in regional grain systems? What are their characteristics? How do the entities or initiatives address identified challenge areas? And what opportunities does this reveal for those participating in or who may become involved with regional grain systems? In the second part, I look specifically at value chain coordination and ask how can value chain coordination be used to develop non-commodity grain systems? Within that, how has value chain coordination been implemented in different regions? And specifically, how do convening events contribute towards the development of regional grain systems? To answer these questions, I conducted a qualitative comparative analysis. In the first part of the paper, I examined 201 entities and initiatives across the U.S. and abroad that are involved in regional grain systems. And in the second part, I examined 3 regional grain convening events to understand how they function and the impacts they have on their participants and regional grain economy. This research involves multiple approaches to information gathering. First, I drew heavily from the 4 books pictured to identify regional grain entities and initiatives. Once identified, I conducted an internet search to verify the information presented and find more information on the subject, in general through the entity's website. I identified additional entities and initiatives through journal articles, news articles, referrals, conference attendance, and an extensive internet search. I also conducted participant observation research at 3 regional grain events. Thomas explains participant observation in his book, How to Do Your Research Project, as research in which the researcher is a participant in one's research situation, and which involves observation as well as conducting interviews, listening to conversations, keeping a diary, taking notes, and much more. After each event, I also had follow-up conversations with event organizers to help fill in the gaps in my knowledge. The notes, artifacts, and data I collected was analyzed using the constant comparative method. Thomas explains this simply. The constant comparative method involves going through your data again and again. This is the constant bit, comparing each element, phrase, sentence, or paragraph with all of the other elements. This is the comparative bit. Through this process, I first identified categories of elements that are involved in non-commodity regional grain systems and sorted the data into these categories. Then within each category, I compared like elements to each other, for example, all the farms, to identify similar and novel characteristics. And third, as I compared the data across categories, I identified a series of cross-cutting themes, including emergent themes and those pre-identified from the literature review as challenge areas or areas of opportunity. This is the scheme for the organization of collected data for the first part, categorized by type of business entity, support entity, or initiative. I cataloged a total of 201 entries, including 168 entities and 33 initiatives. The numbers in parentheses indicate the number of entities or initiatives examined per that type. This is the coding scheme I developed and applied the codes to the data under analysis. The coding scheme informed the cross-cutting themes that I presented in this manner. They include emergent themes that appeared as opportunities for businesses, themes that address needs or challenges identified in the literature review, and areas of opportunity to develop the regional grain economy. In the second part of this analysis, I looked at 3 regional grain convening events that I attended between January and March 2020. Grain School in Colorado, the Northeast Grain Shed Symposium in Boston, and the Philly Grain and Malt Symposium in Philadelphia. These events were selected because they occurred during the data collection phase of this research and were open to the public. This is not meant to indicate that these are the most representative of regional grain convening events, nor the best at what they do, but each event provides a lens into regional grain initiatives in their respective locales and an entry point to understanding the value and structure of regional grain convening events. Each event was examined to understand what catalyzed the event formation, its purpose, actors involved, structure of the event, and event features, engagement strategies used before, during, and after the event, and the event's accomplishments and impacts on the community. Then I looked at how each event displayed the various roles of value chain coordination as laid out by the Wallace Center. I don't have time to discuss my findings for every entity or initiative type or cross-cutting theme, so I'll mention a few that I think are the most interesting. First, I discovered several initiatives in the realms of art, culture, and religion that I think may be an under-considered source of opportunity to impact public consciousness and potentially to drive consumer demand for non-commodity grains. Here I have 2 examples of installation art that demonstrate a valued contribution to the social awareness of grains. Both were in New York City. The first is Agnes Dennis's Wheat Field, a confrontation created in 1982 on a 2-acre plot of land behind the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. The land had become a landfill after construction of the towers. Dennis cleared out the rubble and planted a wheat field. The wheat was also harvested and sent to 28 cities around the world in an exhibition called the International Art Show for the End of World Hunger, and which provided people with seeds to plant. The other example is Danielle Chang's 2019 Living Rice Paddy exhibit that was established on the World Trade Center campus. Danielle is the founder of Lucky Rice and Lucky Chow, both of which aim to shine a spotlight on Asian cuisine. The temporary installation showcased different varieties of rice that was harvested for a feast atop the 3 World Trade Center. Religious institutions, and particularly churches, are also a source of untapped potential in the regional grain economy, but one that holds the power for impactful change, given the role that the sacrament of bread holds for many churches. Honore Farm and Mill in California is a project of the Episcopal Church, a nonprofit organization, and an organic farm that grows heritage varieties of wheat and stone mills them into flour. They sell flour to churches through a CSA for use in making their own communion wafers and run a CSA for home bakers. They conduct consumer education through community planting and harvest days, workshops on bread baking and heirloom grains, an outreach program that delivers education about wheat and bread to children in underserved communities, and their mobile mill travels to schools, churches, synagogues, and farmers markets to demonstrate flour milling on site. The mobile mill was also traveled to the 2018 Episcopal General Convention. And in 2019, they started a National Growers Guild, which has expanded to other churches within the Episcopal Diocese and beyond in California, Arizona, Texas, Kentucky, Michigan, and Minnesota. This project demonstrates the ripple effects the Honore Farm and Mill is able to create, beginning with their congregation, reaching beyond to the surrounding community, and to other churches and communities throughout the country. One of the cross-cutting themes that I looked at was seed diversity. There are basically two different approaches to promote seed diversity. Those that are focused on regenerating ancient heirloom or landrace seeds, and those focused on breeding new varieties. Strategies include seed saving, maintaining or accessing seed banks, conducting variety trials to test for or develop regionally adapted seeds, cataloging restored heritage seeds in the slow food arc of taste, and various plant breeding programs. Prominent strategies in plant breeding are focused on public plant breeding and participatory plant breeding, and can be initiated by university breeding programs, individual farmers, or groups of farmers, like the Northern Plains Sustainable Agriculture Society's Farm Breeding Club. But I also discovered other innovations in the field of plant breeding for sustainable grain systems. One is the development of perennial grains, legumes, and oilseeds, which was first proposed by the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, as a means to reduce tillage and soil disturbance that has accompanied annual cropping systems. The Land Institute has been breeding a number of perennial grains, legumes, and oilseeds, including a grain-like crop of intermediate wheatgrass trademarked as Kernza, and now in the commercialization phase. In fact, the University of Minnesota, along with a team of researchers across states and institutions, was awarded a $10 million grant beginning in September 2020 to scale the research, production, and awareness of Kernza over the next 5 years. Kernza has already been incorporated by chefs, brewers, and bakers into a variety of products ranging from beer to bread, crackers, energy bars, grain salads, waffles, and pancakes. Even Cascadian Farm launched a national cereal brand from Kernza. I was excited to buy Kernza flour and whole grains from the company Perennial Pantry that began shipping direct to consumers in 2020. The second innovation in plant breeding is the development of heterogeneous plant populations, which encapsulates the goal of biodiversity within a single crop field. This approach was being pioneered in England by Martin Wolf at Wakelands Agroforestry, who in combination with the Organic Research Center developed the ORC Wakelands population wheat. The population is bred to be diverse, both genetically and physically, meaning that each seed head might look different from one another. Some may have varying heights, and some may perform differently than others in any given condition. This is an example of evolutionary plant breeding, which means the population will evolve over time to adapt to its changing environment and is natural defense against climate change. Also, the ORC Wakelands population was bred for both yield and quality, hence its nickname YQ. In a 2018 talk at the first International Conference of Wheat Land Races, Martin gives the term basic land races to describe genetically heterogeneous populations associated with particular areas, and bred land races to describe his approach to evolutionary plant breeding. In Nottingham, England, baker Kimberly Bell of Small Food Bakery was able to take this population wheat and bake a loaf of bread with it, which she currently sells at her bakery. She also teaches classes on how to bake with it. There are also several plant populations being developed in the U.S. through Oregon State University's Barley World program. Value chain coordination was another of my cross-cutting themes. The Wallace Center had explained that value chain coordination may be businesses, organizations, or individuals and may be either businesses within the value chain or outside support entities, such as government agencies, nonprofit organizations, or extension services. In my research, I identified 5 cross-sector stakeholder groups that can be categorized as value chain coordination organizations. I also saw examples of businesses within the value chain that display the roles of value chain coordinator, including a farmer, a bakery, a restaurant, and a malt house. Most notably, what distinguishes these entities as value chain coordinators is their involvement with hosting convening events or starting a network or business that serves other members of the value chain. In the second part of my paper, I look at how value chain business, malt house, along with an external support entity, university, and a consortium of grain shed actors serve as value chain coordinators. Prominent value chain coordination strategies include convening events, collaborative projects, cross-sector stakeholder groups, and communications platforms, and focus on networking, education, and variety trials. Furthermore, the Wallace Center had explained that some value chain coordination strategies focus efforts around market centers, while others link many rural producers together in a corridor that can serve multiple market areas. And I saw examples where farmers in the heartland banded together to create businesses that serve distant markets. For example, Heartland Mills in Kansas, Camet International, and Timeless Natural Food in Montana. These businesses contribute to the development of their local or regional economy, although the products were mostly being shipped elsewhere. I think this is an interesting point to consider, since many of the local and regional foods, calls for local and regional foods have originated in urban areas, and particularly along the east and west coasts of the U.S. Some other general findings are that a heavy focus on many regional grain initiatives is on bread, beer, and spirits, and the associated industries of milling, baking, malting, brewing, and distilling. There's a predominant focus on small grains, especially wheat and malting barley. Rice is not a focus of most regional grain initiatives outside of the South Carolina-based Carolina Gold Rice Foundation, even though non-commodity rice is being grown in different areas of the U.S. For example, Nazareth Amen pictured here is in Maryland. I created this diagram to try to condense all the information I was trying to convey into one place. So you see in the center, I try to represent seed diversity through the different approaches to either plant breeding or utilizing ancient or heirloom grains. I represent the different types of grains, and there's also a focus on nutrition and eating whole grains. So some of the entities pictured here, like processors and value-added producers, I've listed a few, as well as different elements and initiatives that contribute to regional grain systems, like communications, art, culture, and religion, education for different individuals and entities, and government. This research was limited by time on the extent of the information collection. It provides a snapshot of businesses, entities, and initiatives within the regional grain economy, but future research may wish to delve deeper into any aspect of regional grain initiatives, either by specific business type or by geographic area. Secondly, the majority of my research was conducted through distance sources, that is, online content and published materials, which limits the amount of understanding I may have gained to a particular situation. In the case where I was able to hear a presentation from a representative of a certain initiative, I was able to gain a further depth of knowledge. Future research may wish to conduct surveys, interviews, and focus groups with the key representatives of these initiatives to gain more perspective on the workings of the initiatives, the needs and resources of each region, and lessons learned. Third, this research does not attempt to assess the effectiveness of any particular strategy or intervention type, but merely presents them as opportunities. Leaders in each region may wish to conduct a needs assessment and resource inventory to help them determine what strategies might be most suitable in their given locale due to particularities in population dynamics, available markets, geographic terrain, climate and cultural and historical precedents, and resource bases such as available farmland and organizational and economic aspects. Finally, this research is on the cutting edge of a quickly evolving field. New needs are continually being identified and strategies being developed. In the second part of convening events, I looked at Grain School, the Northeast Grain Shed Symposium, and Philly Grain and Malt Symposium, and put together a few tables that I don't have time to spend on right now. One is a summary of the events and a comparison of different information. Then I looked at the event features, some that were common, some that were unique to each event. Participant engagement strategies before, during, and after each event. And also how the value chain coordination roles were enacted at each event. So one interesting finding is that for each of the 3 events under study, a value chain coordination organization was formed, either as a result of the event or through related efforts, and each organization used the event as a recruitment and engagement opportunity. So for example, Northeast Grain Shed, the symposium was held in January 2020 for the first time for the explicit purpose of launching the organization. So that's an interesting relationship between the event and the organization that then ensued. Grain School started in 2016, but their related value chain coordination organization, Colorado Grain Chain, evolved in 2019, and it did spring directly out of that event. For the Philly Grain and Malt Symposium, the Pennsylvania Grain Coalition was a more informal gathering that was coordinated through Altogether Now PA. So that had a little bit of a different structure. Also, as you see how recent all of these organizations were formed, 2019 and 2020, so it's all really fresh. Secondly, hard infrastructure started touching down in Colorado. So the purpose of value chain coordination is to develop soft infrastructure so that participants are better prepared to acquire and utilize hard infrastructure in their communities. And in Colorado, just this year, they are under development of a 3-year grant project to construct a tortilleria in a rural area of Colorado. And they also established, just in 2020, a 501c3 milling enterprise in Boulder, Colorado, by a baker, the owner of Moxie Bread Co. in Louisville, Colorado. And this entity mills grains for sale to other bakeries, restaurants, and other businesses. The limitations of this section of the research are that, given the short tenure of the events, it can be hard to draw long-term conclusions. Colorado Grain School is the longest-running event of the 3 under study, having begun in 2016. It's the only initiative to move so far from soft infrastructure development to hard infrastructure, and that just occurred in 2020. Furthermore, I was looking at these organizations' activities during the coronavirus pandemic, which may have thwarted some of their post-event activities. My intention for this research was to develop a resource that would be helpful to practitioners working in the space of regional grains. In addition to the opportunities and considerations I highlight throughout, I give 2 recommendations for applied practice. First is the formation of a national network, a community of practice that can serve as a place for those engaged in regional grain development in their communities to connect, share information and ideas, and identify best practices. I suggest this could be called Grain Changers and could be housed within the Wallace Center or through the North American Staples Network currently being developed by the Appalachian Staple Foods Collaborative. Secondly, I propose the launch of a national campaign in 2022 to center the role of grain in our lives, utilizing installation art and educational initiatives. This would be a celebration or a 40-year memorial of Agnes Dennis's Wheatfield, A Confrontation. This would be an opportunity for the regional grain advocacy groups that have arisen across the country to highlight any grain that each group chooses, yet find a support structure through a coordinated effort to potentially secure funding and magnify efforts with mass press coverage. Thank you for your time. Are there any questions?
Any questions for Jesse?
I feel like you've dealt with my questions for a long time already and addressed them in many ways. But I love the way it all came together. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more, and I know you did this, but like speak a little bit more about kind of those initiatives around rice and other grains, and whether you see any dissonance, right, in kind of expanding what we mean by grains in this conversation. Because I know you and I, like in the beginning, I kept pushing back a bit on what you were talking about and which grains, and now I feel like, when I look at this, I think, oh, I wonder, you really kind of outline certain kinds of opportunities, and so I'm wondering if you see any, anything that might get in the way, right? Or any opportunities in relation to that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the thing about the small grains networks is, they can connect through various steps, and that's what value chain coordination is about, is like connecting the various entities, from the farmer to the miller to the baker, for example, in the case of the bread small grains value chain, or for the case of the beer, from the farmer to the maltster to the brewer. So, there are those opportunities there. And with rice can be milled, and it can be made into many different value-added products. So I thought it was interesting to find out about like some rice growers wanting to turn the Carolina gold rice into sake. So, and it can be milled into flour and made into crackers and noodles and everything else. So it has the potential to be able to serve in the same way. But I think culturally it's just not, it doesn't have the same status. And I'm really interested in Pittsburgh, just to look at all the Asian restaurants, and I want Chris to look at this and, encourage like rice production and soy production and tofu making.
Yeah, actually, I think John Taylor, John did, who was in this position before Chris, we did a series of rice trials in the ADG as one of the last things he did, and we ran into a lot of trouble with the number of sunny days, like days at a particular temperature and days at a particular, and so I think out of the three varieties, there was one that came to seed, and one that we got that didn't go moldy. But I think one of the things I was thinking about, I agree with what you're saying. One of the things I was thinking about is that a lot of the rice initiatives that you're talking about are actually, kind of they're actually sort of chef driven, right, rather than food producer or small business driven. And I think there are cultural and kind of industry differences sometimes within that. Do you know what I mean? And so I'm not looking for problems, but I think what you're saying is interesting. Like, how can we think about not only just where these different initiatives start, but like broadening where they can go, even if they're small and regional.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to look at rice from, many folks, like the books that I used in my literature review to pull these entities are not so much talking about rice. They talk about Cornell's small grains breeding program, but at the same time, Cornell has the SRI Rice Research Institute, and they have rice breeding programs as well at the same institution. So yeah, it's just interesting to see culturally, and you're totally right of, where does it come from? It's coming from chefs. Is this coming from farmers, bakers, etc.?
Thanks, Jesse.
Hey, Jesse. I wanted to ask more about, you said you wanted to do like a national grain thing, like that was like one of like your proposed solutions to this, and you said, was it the Wallace Institute, or?
Yeah, I suggested the Wallace Center just because they had been involved with a national grant that was a couple years called FoodLink, and they coordinated that, so there were 13 different sites across the U.S. that they coordinated. So, and they have the resources on value chain coordination. That's why I suggested them.
Gotcha. And did you like find a lot of your research from them, or did you like you just came upon them through your readings and things like that?
Yeah, I don't know how maybe Atlas told me about them, but yeah, I just learned they do have a lot of resources, and also they contributed on a report with the USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service on food value chains.
Cool. Thank you.
Jesse, as I was listening to you present, I thought about the number of different experiences that you've had throughout your time in the food studies program. You know, some of them in courses, some of them outside of courses, some of them kind of on your own, some of which you kind of specifically write about here. But just wonder if there are experiences that you still want to gain, or if you feel like you want to kind of get better perspective of what's happening in terms of the world of regional grain, or kind of what roles you see yourself in after being able to see a landscape like the one you examined. You know, where you see yourself kind of fitting in moving forward.
Yeah. I'm interested in getting some more hands-on experience with grain growing and milling. So I'm looking into different opportunities here to explore that further. Equipment is the thing, right? So maybe it's easy for a farm in the Midwest with lots of machinery. So trying to do that on a smaller scale is the challenge, and I'd like to explore that, as well as getting involved with this Appalachian Staple Foods Collaborative and the North American Staples Network. And being a seed keeper, I like to pass around seeds for other folks that might want to grow some things. If anyone wants anything, let me know.
Any other questions? Yeah, please unmute your mic and give Jesse a